Hello, this is Rabbi David Abramson. This week's Torah portion is the double portion known as Parashat Mattot Mas'eh. Before we jump into the parasha, I need to talk to you a little bit about translations and pronunciations of biblical names. There are a lot of biblical characters whom we know primarily by the English translation of their names. If I were to mention the name Moshe, many, but not all of you would recognize the Hebrew name, but of course we've all heard of Moses. I generally prefer to use Hebrew pronunciations of biblical names, and usually that's not too complicated, since the English translations are usually simply adaptations of the Hebrew originals. But sometimes things do get lost in translation. Consider, for example, the Hebrew name Yehudah. If we were to transliterate it, it would be rendered Yehudah. But in translation, it becomes Judah. Okay, Judah is not that far from Yehudah. Consider the name Reuven, the name of one of the tribes that is a central character in our story. Transliterated, we would render it Reuven. Translated, Reuben. But here too, Reuben isn't all that far from Reuven. But now let's consider the name of another one of the tribes in our story, God. And how should we transliterate God? You see the problem with some transliterations. So rather than referring to Bnei Reuven as the children of Reuven, and Bnei Gad as the children of God, we'll use a standard biblical translation, Reubenites and Gadites. And now let's turn to Parashat Mattot Mas'eh itself. The story I want to share with you is one that I will call, for want of a better title, the story of the 2.5 tribes. Our story is taken from Numbers chapter 32. These are among the final chapters of the book of Numbers, and the focus is on the Holy Land and the future of the Israelites in that promised land. The Israelites, at this point in the story, are in what today is called Jordan. The area used to be called Transjordan, beyond the Jordan. They are on the east side of the Jordan River, whereas what we call Israel, or what we consider the Holy Land, is on the west side of the Jordan River. With the hindsight of history, or of reading the book of Joshua, we know that the Israelites will cross the Jordan River, and beginning with their conquest of the city of Jericho, will begin the arduous process of reclaiming their ancestral homeland. In the meantime, here in the book of Numbers, some of the Israelites aren't so sure that they want to settle west of the Jordan. The land here in Transjordan is looking attractive to some of the Israelites. This story is a long one, and I'll read much of the story in Numbers chapter 32 to you, but I won't display each and every verse of this chapter, only some of the verses. But I will begin with the first part of the first verse of our story. Umikne Rav haya livnei Reuven v'livnei Gad atzum ma'od. The Reubenites and the Gadites owned cattle in very great numbers. The Reubenites and the Gadites owned cattle in very great numbers, noting that the lands of Yazer and Gilad were a region suitable for cattle. The Gadites and the Reubenites came to Moses, Eleazar the priest, and the chieftains of the community and said, and I'll warn you, the next verse is just a list of place names, Atarot and Divon and Yazer and Nimrah and Heshbon and El Aleh and Savam and Nevo and Baon. The land that Adonai has conquered for the community of Israel is cattle country, and we, your servants, have cattle. It would be a favor to us, they continued, if this land were given to your servants as a holding. Do not move us across the Jordan. Vayomer Moshe livnei Gad v'livnei Reuven. Moses replied to the Gadites and the Reubenites, Ha'achechem yavo'u lamilchama v'atem teshvu fo. Are your brothers to go to war while you stay here? Ve'lama tini'un et leiv b'nei Yisrael me'avor el ha'aretz asher natan lahem Adonai. Why will you turn the minds of the Israelites from crossing into the land that Adonai has given them? What's at issue is not only this group's potential failure to fight with the rest of the Israelites when they go to battle, but also the effect that this defection will have on Israelite morale. And Moses has his own long, difficult history with Israelite morale. Moses continues, "That is what your fathers did when I sent them from Kadesh Barnea to survey the land." And now Moses is going to review some of the notorious story of the 12 spies who went into the land and who came out, and the 10 of the 12 presenting a frightening picture of the indigenous population, which resulted in a panic among the Israelites. And so Moses continues with verse 9. After going up to the Wadi Eshkol and surveying the land, they turned the minds of the Israelites from invading the land that Adonai had given them. Thereupon Adonai was incensed, and God swore, "None of the men from 20 years up who came out of Egypt shall see the land that I promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, for they did not remain loyal to me. None except Caleb, son of Yefuneh, the Kenizzite, and Yehoshua, son of Nun, for they remained loyal to Adonai." Adonai was incensed at Israel, and for 40 years God made them wander in the wilderness until the whole generation that had provoked Adonai's displeasure was gone. V'hinei kamtem tachat avotechem tarbut anashim chataim. And now you, a breed of sinful men, have replaced your fathers. Lispod od al charon af Adonai el Yisrael, to add still further to Adonai's wrath against Israel. Ki teshuvun me'acharav, if you turn away from God, v'yasaf od lahanecho bamidbar, and God abandons them once more in the wilderness, v'shichatem l'chol ha'am hazeh, you will bring calamity on all this people. Moses has struggled with this dynamic in the Israelite community throughout his leadership of the Israelites, literally from the beginning, from the time he returned to Egypt to demand of Pharaoh, "Let my people go," and then to try to convince the Israelites to follow him out of Egypt and into freedom. And now we can understand Moses' frustration and his anger at yet another challenge to God's plan. But then the Reubenites and the Gadites do something right. Then they stepped up to him and said, "We will build here sheepfolds for our flocks and towns for our children, and we will hasten as shock troops in the van of the Israelites until we have established them in their home, while our children stay in the fortified towns because of the inhabitants of the land." And then they make the following promise to Moses. "Lo nashuv el batenu, we will not return to our homes. Ad hitnachel b'nei Yisrael ish nachalato, until every one of the Israelites is in possession of his portion. But we will not have a share with them in the territory beyond the Jordan, for we have received our share on the east side of the Jordan." And now Moses responds to their promise. Vayomer aleihem Moshe, Moses said to them, "Im ta'asun et hadavar hazeh, if you do this, im techalatzu lifnei Adonai lamilchama, if you go into battle as shock troops at the insistence of Adonai, va'avar lachem kol chalutz et hayardain, and every shock fighter among you crosses the Jordan, lifnei Adonai, at the insistence of Adonai, ad horisho et oyavav mipanav, until God has dispossessed God's enemies before God, v'nichbesha haaretz lifnei Adonai, and the land has been subdued at the insistence of Adonai, v'achar tashuvu, and then you return, v'hitem nikiyim me Adonai umi Yisrael, then you shall be clear before Adonai and before Israel, V'hayeta ha'aretz hazot lachem la'achuzah lifnei Adonai. And this land shall be your holding under Adonai. By the way, although only the Reubenites and the Gadites are mentioned early in this story, half of the tribe of Manasseh is mentioned later, and ultimately it is these 2.5 tribes that settle east of the Jordan River. And so our story has a happy ending. V'hitem nikiyim me Adonai umi Yisrael. You shall be clear before Adonai and before Israel. The request of the 2.5 tribes appeared at first glance to be illegitimate. But once they reassure Moses that they will not forget their responsibility toward their Israelite brothers and sisters, once they assure Moses that they will act on that responsibility when needed, then their request is accepted. And indeed, if we look at this map of the subsequent settlement of the Holy Land, we see most of the tribes here west of the Jordan River and the Dead Sea, and we see Reuven, Gad, and half of Manasseh here on the eastern side of the Jordan. Of course, this story should speak to us as well. Is it legitimate for Jews today to live outside the Holy Land? There are many Jews today, Jews born and raised in Israel, and Jews who settled in Israel recently or even decades ago, who believe that especially after 1948, there is no legitimate reason to live outside of Israel. But most of us, myself included, have chosen to make our lives in the diaspora. I've visited Israel many times, and I've lived in Israel for longer periods, a summer here, the better part of a year there. But I never did make Aliyah. I didn't make Israel my permanent home. So I didn't serve in the Israel Defense Forces, and I don't pay taxes in Israel. I don't enjoy the benefits of living in the Holy Land, but I don't bear the burdens of permanent residence in Israel either. So maybe the story of the 2.5 tribes should speak to us Jews who have lived much or most of our lives outside of Israel. Perhaps the lesson is that it is legitimate for us to live in the diaspora as long as we always remember our responsibilities toward Israel. Supporting Israel is complicated, certainly more complicated than following 1948 or following 1967. Support of Israel comes in different forms, and many of us struggle with just what it means to support Israel today. But I think the fundamental lesson of the story of the 2.5 tribes is for us to work hard at supporting Israel and in figuring it out, each in our own way. But that's just the simple meaning, in a sense, the pshat of the story. As is their wont, the rabbis find additional levels of meaning in their readings of our biblical stories. Let's explore some of those. For our first interpretation, a lesson from the Mishnah, let's first take another look at Moses' reassuring message to the Reubenites and the Gadites. V'hitem nikiyim me Adonai umi Yisrael. You shall be clear before Adonai and before Israel. Now, why the apparent redundancy? Why is it necessary to indicate that these tribes will be clear before God and that in addition they will be clear before their fellow Israelites? Well, the Mishnah teaches the following. Lefi she'adam tzarich latzet yedei habriot kederech she'tzarich latzet yedei hamakom. For it is one's duty to be free of blame before people as before God. Shene'emar, as it is said, again from our story, V'hitem nikiyim me Adonai umi Yisrael. You shall be clear before Adonai and before Israel. The verse mentions both God and Israel to teach an important ethical lesson. In general, we should strive to be as blameless as possible before God, and no less importantly, before our fellow human beings. The rabbis derive this point from that verse in our parsha. But the rabbis provide an additional proof text This one from the book of Proverbs. Ve'omer, and it says, tzachen v'sechel tov be'enei Elohim v'yadam. Do these words sound familiar to you? In Birkat Hamazon, the grace after meals, we ask for God's blessing upon us and our loved ones, and we paraphrase this passage from Proverbs, only changing the conjugation of the verb at the beginning. And we sing, V'nimtza chen v'seichel tov be'enei Elohim v'yadam. And may we find grace and good favor in the eyes of God and humanity. But here, the Mishnah is citing this verse to underscore the lesson that they derived from the verse in our story, that one of our ongoing concerns should be to live our lives in ways that will earn the grace and favor of God and our fellow human beings. The rabbis make a similar point in a different Mishnah related to Yom Kippur. Aveirot shebein Adam lamakom, for sins between a person and God, Yom HaKippurin mechaper. Yom Kippur achieves atonement. Not just Yom Kippur, the day itself, but the Yom Kippur experience, the process of doing the good, hard work of teshuvah, repentance. And so the Mishnah begins by telling us, if we do Yom Kippur properly, sincerely, intensely, then we can assume that our Yom Kippur experience will achieve atonement for the sins that we've committed against God. However, Aveirot ben Adam lachaveiro, for sins between a person and fellow human beings, ein Yom HaKippurim mechaper, Yom Kippur will not achieve atonement ad shiratzeh et chaveiro, until one satisfies one's fellow human being. Now I want to explore a discussion from a Midrashic collection known as Midrash Rabbah. This is long and dense, so I'll plow through certain passages, displaying only some lines on the screen. This Midrashic collection does begin with the verse that by now is familiar to you. Umikne Rav haya livnei Reuven v'livnei Gad. The Reubenites and the Gadites owned cattle in very great numbers. The Midbar Rabbah continues, 3 gifts were created in the world. A person meriting one of them receives what is most desirable in the whole world. A person meriting wisdom has merited everything. A person meriting strength has merited everything. A person meriting wealth has merited everything. Well, wisdom, strength, and wealth, those are the things that many of us look forward to achieving in our lives, and so that's a nice assertion. If you have wisdom or strength or wealth, you have merited everything. But then the text asks, Ematai, when? When is this the case? And the answer is, when they are gifts of the heavens and come from the power of Torah. When you've merited wisdom or merited strength or merited wealth, and they come from heaven, they come from the power of Torah, then you have everything. But then the rabbis go on. But human strength and wealth are nothing. Or perhaps a better translation is, but human strength and wealth alone are nothing. For thus has King Solomon, the putative author of the book of Ecclesiastes, stated, I have further observed under the sun that the race is not won by the swift, nor the battle by the valiant, nor is bread won by the wise, nor wealth by the intelligent, nor favor by the learned, for the time of mischance comes to all. Thus also has the prophet Jeremiah stated, thus says Adonai, let not the wise boast in their wisdom, nor the strong boast in their strength, nor the wealthy boast in their wealth, but only in this should one glory. And to read the rest of Jeremiah 9:23, that one's earnest devotion to me, for I, Adonai, act with kindness, justice, and equity in the world, for in these I delight, declares Adonai. Wisdom and strength and wealth are all well and good, but if we do not achieve them as gifts of heaven, if their power comes not from the power of Torah, they ultimately are not of great value. Umatanot elu, so these gifts, bisman she'enan ba'in min hakadosh baruch hu, when they do not come from the Holy Blessed One, so finally he pasek mimenu, will finally be cut off from them. The rabbis now continue with a longish list of people who had achieved wisdom or strength or wealth and who came to bad endings. Our sages taught, 2 wise men arose in the world, one from Israel and one from the nations of the world. Achitophel was from Israel, while Bil'am was from the nations of the world, but both of them were lost from the world. Achitophel was a brilliant advisor to King David, who came to a bad ending. Bil'am was the prophet for hire, who was hired to curse the Israelites, about whom we read just a couple weeks ago, and who also came to a bad ending. The rabbis continue, 2 strong men arose in the world. One was from Israel and one from the nations of the world. Samson was from Israel, while Goliath was from the nations of the world, but both of them were lost from the world. And finally, the rabbis remind us, 2 wealthy men arose in the world. One was from Israel and one was from the nations of the world. Korach from Israel and Haman from the nations of the world. Korach led a rebellion against the leadership of Moses and Aaron, really a rebellion against God. And of course, we know what Haman did, and the rabbis remind us, but both of them were lost from the world. So 6 examples of biblical characters who achieved wisdom and strength and wealth, respectively, and who all came to bad endings. Shelo haya matanatan min hakadosh baruch hu, because their gift was not from the Holy Blessed One, ela chotfin otah lahem, rather they grabbed it up for themselves. V'chein ata motzei bivnei Gad uvnei Reuven, so also do you find with the Gadites and the Reubenites, shahayu ashirim v'haya lahem mikneh gadol, that they were very wealthy and had a lot of livestock. V'chibechu et mamonam v'yashavu lachem chutz me'eretz Yisrael, but they loved their money and resided outside the land of Israel as a result. To put it in contemporary terms, their materialism got in the way of their Zionism. They loved their money and their other possessions. They loved the creature comforts and the security that came from their wealth more than they valued the idea of living in the Holy Land with their fellow Israelites. Ultimately, the 2.5 tribes were permitted to live in Transjordan, but I think that the rabbis are adding a comment about them, namely, shame on them. But wait, there's more. Lefichach galu techila mikol hashvatim. For that reason, they were the first of the tribes to go into exile. Of course, was centuries later. Shene'emar, as it is stated in the book of Chronicles, Vayaglem liruveni v'lagadi v'lachatzi shevet Menashe. And he carried them into exile, namely the Reubenites, the Gadites, and the half-tribe of Menashe. Umi garam lahem, who brought the exile upon them, al shehifrishu atzmam min achehem bishvil kinyanam. It happened because they had separated themselves from their brethren for the sake of their livestock. Minayin, and where is that shown? Mima shekatuv b'Torah, from what is written in the Torah, this verse that we're so familiar with by now, Umikneh Rav haya livnei Reuven v'gomer. The Reubenites and the Gadites owned cattle in great numbers, etc. A simple story, at least one that at first glance appears to be a simple story, a request that's initially considered illegitimate, promises that are made and accepted, and an accommodation for 2.5 tribes. But the simple story reveals some important lessons. Lessons about our connection to the Holy Land and our responsibilities to our brothers and sisters in that land. Ethical lessons about our relationships with God and with our fellow human beings. Lessons about ephemeral accomplishments and true greatness. And even lessons about the dangers of materialism. Another illustration of the rabbinic axiom about studying Torah, hafochba v'hafochba d'cholava, turn it over and turn it over, for everything can be found in it. Shabbat Shalom.